Hello, I'm Elizabeth Allured, co-president of Climate Psychology Alliance North America, and I'm here to interview Wendy Greenspun, who is one of our steering committee members and is doing a lot of work with climate-aware therapy and has a lot to tell us about her work. And I think it's fascinating when a person starts to focus on this, that there can be new things to learn and things that we can all learn from. So Wendy, did you want to say a little bit about your work first?
Well, I want to kind of thank CPA North America because, our newly distributed climate aware therapy directory, I think, has really been helping individuals who are struggling with climate distress, climate grief, various reactions to the climate and environmental crisis, find therapists who have interest and knowledge and skill in helping navigate these really difficult waters. So I have felt really privileged to be getting some referrals from this directory, people who maybe wouldn't have known how to find a therapist. And I've been really struck, and I've been doing work before that with individuals as well as groups who have been struggling with their distress around these topics and various kinds of embedded other crises in their lives, and have done some writing about it. And so I'm happy to be talking about it in more depth with you today.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the Climate Aware Therapist Directory that you've been getting some referrals from, and most people may not really understand what we mean when we say a climate aware therapist. So what are your thoughts about, what does that term mean?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it may be a term that describes, maybe it doesn't describe everything that we mean by it, by being climate aware, because it's climate and environment and various forms of othering and separation from a recognition of our interconnection in the more than human world and among groups of individuals and cultures. But when I think of, if I just focus in on what does being a climate aware therapist mean, I think first of all, having a deep recognition of the crisis that is going on in our biosphere, in species loss, and the multiple ways that our planetary system is being disrupted, and then the larger implications for us as a human species, etc. And so I think being climate aware is like really being aware that this is going on and having a recognition of how this is starting to disrupt all kinds of things in our lives. And that reflects what many groups have already been struggling with. So an awareness of the embedded other kinds of trauma and crisis for marginalized communities, the history of colonialism and systemic racism that's embedded in this, that many communities have been grappling with. This is not the first existential crisis, but for some individuals, especially individuals of privilege, maybe they haven't reckoned with this. So I think having that complexity of awareness is really important as a climate aware therapist. I also think being climate aware as a therapist means not seeing climate distress as a displacement of some other issue going on, because I've heard from clients who've come to me or who've been in groups that I've done who say they've gone to the therapist they've been seeing and started to talk about their panic and despair and grief about what's going on ecologically. And they were sort of met with some kind of skepticism about, like, this isn't the real issue. This isn't really what it's about. So I think being climate aware means, again, sort of holding the complexity. There is a reality, there is a distress and a grief and a loss that is going on, and the reality of that. And also being able to see how any given individual who comes into our consulting room might be processing that through the lens of their own personal history, cultural history, intergenerational trauma, and sort of the larger historical picture of who they are. So I think it involves really being able to hold these multiple ideas and go in more depth about it, as well as thinking about trauma and how you help people manage their emotional distress. So it might be about being able to help with self-regulation skills, as there might be some other ways that you're doing therapeutic work. So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Well, thank you. It's really helpful to hear your explanation of the larger picture, because when someone might hear the term climate aware therapist, they might think, oh, well, I'm aware of the climate crisis. I know there's a climate crisis, and what's the big deal about being aware of the climate crisis? But we're really talking here about being aware of much larger issues and much more pervasive problems that have existed before the climate crisis, but that the climate crisis is simply exacerbating or showing us how the problems in our society are enlarged by this other problem.
Right, the threat multiplier.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and I would say that I think even in, here we're having this interview in early August 2021, and this summer there have been so many extreme weather events and wildfires and floods, and I think there is growing awareness in the broader community that was kind of saying, oh, this is something in the future we have to worry about, that some individuals who had not been personally touched by this are now seeing this as a real reality. And so I think distress level is growing, awareness is growing, and the need for, when people are particularly distressed and dysregulated by this, the need for climate aware therapy is probably growing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you've brought up that, as clinicians, we have been trained in modalities that we use for other kinds of problems, whether they're problems in our family relationships or problems in relationship to moving through anxiety or depression from other reasons. And, although that is also true in this situation, that stirs up anxiety, it might stir up depression. What do you see as the difference in working with climate as opposed to other kinds of anxieties or other kinds of things that might lead one to feel depressed?
So that's a really great question, because it's similar and different. I mean, for me, one big difference is that I feel like, unlike certain traumas that individuals come to see me about from their life or stressors, I'm struggling with the same distress. I'm embedded in the same crisis that the people I'm seeing are struggling with. And so there's something very, I'm sure there have been other moments, political moments, 9/11. I can think of other times in my practice where maybe I was going through something similar, but the enormity of this crisis, the all-encompassing aspect of it, I think for me has felt like a challenge that's pretty big at times, to have my own feelings echoed by the people that I'm working with. So that's probably one aspect. And then some of what I mentioned before about kind of you're dealing with a reality, as well as the lens of how the person is processing it. So being able to kind of hold both. And I suppose we do that in many parts of our work, sort of holding the reality as well as what the person does with the reality in their trying to process what's going on. And I think another, and that this may not be different from certain kinds of clinical work, being able to kind of go back and forth between helping manage the level of distress so it's not too overwhelming, but not kind of moving away from the important feelings that need to get processed, the deep grief, the despair, the anger, the helplessness. And those are really hard feelings to sit with. I find it really, at times, really painful and really difficult, but also incredibly meaningful, like to be engaged in this journey together, to sit with the pain together, to bear witness to what someone is facing as they're, really feeling the depth of this, as their heart is breaking for what's going on in the world, as Steffi Bednarik would say, that's an important experience for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that those of us who are also doing this work can really relate to what you're saying about being presented sort of at different times with very painful situations that people find themselves in, awarenesses about problems that they can't themselves solve. And we're used to people coming to us with a problem maybe that we can get a handle on and we can see, a resolution down the road. And this one is different. I'm thinking of when an adolescent came to me and was worried about would she be able to have a child in the future, and was the world going to be okay? And how do you be honest with your clients while feeling your own heart kind of breaking with what they're facing? And we need to be honest as well as find some meaning in the problem that's so huge. So I'm sort of resonating with the difficulty that you're talking about. And what would you say is maybe the most difficult aspect of the work for you?
Well, I think it's that. I think it's not feeling that I can kind of reassure or make things better or even foster hope, which, sometimes I feel the pull to want to do that, as opposed to just being able to stay with and bear, the enormity and the pain. And that's hard work. It sometimes feels like it sits inside of me, like my heart gets heavy when I listen to and sit with the pain of those who are really starting to reckon with this.
Mm-hmm. That makes me wonder, understandably, this is stirring up a lot of feelings to be a therapist, hearing about this with different people at different times. And what do you do with all the feelings that you're having, in the session or after the session?
Yeah, that's a very useful question. And I think about it a lot. I feel very privileged to have individuals and groups that I have become part of, through Climate Psychology Alliance, as well as some other forums, where I'm connecting with other therapists who are doing this work. And very often, the sense of camaraderie, the sense of shared connection to how hard this work is, but how important it is, really helps me bear it. And when something's particularly difficult, like with any clinical matter that is really distressing or difficult, I seek consultation. I seek a colleague with whom I can talk about how incredibly painful it is. I also have a very supportive partner that I can talk to about the emotions that are coming up for me. So I think, like we are doing for our clients in doing this work, so that there's a place to feel they're not alone in it by sitting with a therapist, by processing these feelings with a therapist, to have a therapist who helps contain and hold, and we could call it mentalize, what's so difficult about this. I need that for myself. And so I seek that from my colleagues and my own therapist, to help me at times when it really feels like it's so difficult to bear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad to hear about that, because it's sort of like what we give to others, we sometimes need ourselves.
And I thought of one other thing, sorry to interrupt you. I think getting engaged with doing climate psychology work, like training others and doing presentations and giving workshops as I've done, or running climate cafe. I feel like when I can do something, I also feel less helpless. And I think that's something that often comes up in the clinical work too, of like, how do you help someone when they're ready, if they're ready to engage in meaningful ways, so that they're not just stuck in a sense of helplessness. And that's true for myself as well.
Well, that makes me think, when we work with our clients around many different issues, we often, after we're working through the feelings and understanding the feelings, we help them understand, maybe are they playing a part in a situation? And although we can't we can't solve the whole problem, we might be able to affect a little part of the problem. And maybe in your work, and I know some in my work, I try to find that part that an individual might want to get excited about working with. And it's not always at the beginning of the therapy, because there's a lot to process and understand before we truly understand the problem. So I think it's got a number of steps in our work with people, but each step is really important.
Yeah, you're making me think about, and I'm glad you said that you don't want to necessarily do that at the beginning, because I think if someone engages in actions, sometimes there's a defensive quality to that, or they can engage in ways that they sort of burn out if they haven't kind of processed some of the feelings. Now, for other people, that works really well, so it depends completely on the individual. But you're making me think in broader ways about, I think some of the work also ends up moving toward how do you build emotional resilience, or what I often like to call like sustainability of the emotional system, because to do this work, to face this painful reality and the embedded multiple layers of psychosocial trauma, it's a lot. And so you have to build some resilience, and resilience can come from taking actions in small ways or big ways. It can come from creativity. It can come from good self-care. It can come from the processing of emotions. It can come from joining with others and building community. So there's lots of things that can emerge as part of the therapy work, and in helping someone to identify what would be important for them as they reckon with this.
Well, that brings me around to sort of thinking about the bigger picture that we're embedded in, and we're doing individual work with our clients. There are ways of bringing this to groups also, to move it into a bigger arena. Do you have any thoughts about, how do you see yourself working with groups versus individuals, or is it a very different kind of work, or how's that go?
No, it's a really important question. And I know it's one that, as a therapist, I love doing therapeutic work. I love my profession. I've loved being a therapist. I've been doing this work for 40 years. But sometimes in the face of such an enormous problem, I feel like individual therapy can feel like kind of a drop in the bucket, even though it's useful, it's helpful, people need it. It's where my skills lie. And so it feels meaningful and important, but also sometimes doesn't feel quite big enough, or where the work needs to be done. And I think especially as some people are thinking more about, maybe at this point we need to be thinking about adaptation and helping communities. It's not my forte as much to work with communities, but I do like doing group work. And I do think that in this area of climate distress and climate grief, that people often really benefit from joining with others who are feeling something similar. Like I said, I do on my own in joining with other climate psychology folks, which helps me immensely to not feel alone. So I've been doing some climate cafes. I know you have as well. And climate cafes are an arena. It's not a clinical space per se, but I think we can use some of our clinical awareness of how to help facilitate people talking about their emotions and their distress and pain and grief and anger and everything with each other, and to again create sort of a safe holding environment for that. So that has felt like it's been really meaningful. And then I've also brought some of this work to working with climate activists and students who are studying environmental science or sustainability, workshops on building emotional resilience. And that includes a piece of how do you process the emotions, making room for that, as well as talking about different things that can help in the face of distress and building that emotional resilience. So those are a couple of ways that I have found that I feel like I can use my own background, experience, and talents to facilitate more. And I'm sure there are many other ways to do that as well.
Well, this has given us a lot of food for thought. And I'm really pleased to hear about your work. I'm pleased to hear about sort of the complexity of it and how we can help each other understand how to do this work, which can be very challenging. And, as the climate crisis kind of worsens, we have more work to do. So I'm sure there'll be more therapists who'll be needing to learn how to work with these issues. So I really value the conversation we've had today. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we go? Or
I thought of one other piece, which is I don't know how important, but I also think about using a trauma lens, and I don't know how much I spoke to that I think people who've been trained in doing trauma work and considering the various kinds of psychological trauma people are going through, whether anticipating or having gone through displacement, disruption, being marginalized, that awareness of how trauma disrupts kind of life as we've known it. And that's what I've been seeing emerging more in people who are coming to me with climate distress. And then recognizing, the layers of trauma that might already be present for that person, whether on a cultural or familial level, personal trauma that then gets magnified and echoed by the climate crisis. So I think just having that awareness is important. So I just wanted to make sure I got that in.
I'm really glad you brought that in, and I'll just add on to that. While we're saying that people bring in other traumas that are related to this, that does not mean that we should only focus on these historical old traumas, just because they're easier for us to think about and because we were trained in how to handle those old traumas, but that they're somehow intertwined, and we need to be thinking about both kinds of trauma as we're working with them.
Yes. And I'm glad you said that, because that's kind of what I had said earlier about not seeing it as a displacement. I think my awareness is that when there's been previous trauma, it echoes with, like, the climate crisis then adds on to that. It's like a greater sensitivity, which may be useful for someone really being able to face, what feels unfaceable, that having gone through trauma and the previous trauma, sometimes you can even look at how they were able to manage it, that they can use some of the same skills, or where they didn't get help with processing previous trauma. Unprocessed trauma then makes it harder in facing further trauma. So I appreciate that reminder of holding that complexity and not focusing only on previous issues, and feeling, again, like it's a displacement when people talk about the climate trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again, Wendy, for sharing, this great work you're doing, and how we can all sort of listen and learn, because we'll all be expecting to have these issues presented in our offices and wherever we're working. So really glad that you were able to speak with us, and look forward to hearing from you again.
I appreciate being invited to do this, and for your grace and sensitivity and awareness in asking such thoughtful questions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.